develop themselves and their surroundings in a way that felt modern and contemporary. And importantly, they sought to lead such a normal life in Russia. So unlike up-and-coming youth in the 1990s, they found emigration to no longer be an imperative for leading such a normal life. And the picture also conveys how since the early 2000s, the Putin governments have seized on Soviet imagery to create a romanticized picture of the past. And one aim was to revive Soviet forms of youth engagement, to motivate young people to become active members of economy and society. And those of you who are well-versed in the literature on authoritarianism might be familiar with the autocratic paradox. It means that the authoritarian state feels kind of pressure to stimulate civic engagement while maintaining strict control over society. So reviving Soviet forms of youth engagement in a neo-imperial Russian spirit answers to this need for stimulating participation. And now I want to start with situating the book in larger debates on authoritarianism, legitimacy, and neoliberalism. And we will return to some of these debates when I introduce the conceptual metaphors that structure my argument in a second part of the talks. And then I will show you more PowerPoint slides and a video clip and things like that. But let me start with telling you more about the bigger picture of my research. So my broader research interest is how culture paves the way for authoritarian rule to be tolerated or even embraced. And I understand culture not as a bounded set of values or practices, but as an analytical dimension of the social. So culture draws our attention to how people assign meaning to situations and relationships. And especially experts on Eastern and Central Europe or the post-Soviet states might now hear alarm bells ringing. Did you really combine the concepts culture and authoritarianism? And indeed, such a reaction is well-founded. Margaret Mead and Geoffrey Gorer's swaddling thesis, better known jokingly as diaporology, is but one extreme example of how alarmingly problematic the study of authoritarianism from a cultural angle can be. They linked the way babies were wrapped in swaddling to Soviet citizens' attitudes towards authority. So public ridicule is justified and might be the most effective way to discredit such studies. Yet I contend that in order to arrive at a more nuanced understanding of how legitimation in authoritarian context works, we can hardly do otherwise but take culture into account. If we do take seriously that the symbolic power of dictators is limited, and if we take seriously that political subjects to have some kind of minimal agency and that they can discern propaganda from state and business, then we need to study those unruly processes of meaning making that the concept of culture kind of packages. And I think only then we get to investigate the actual texture of loyalty. And otherwise, we risk confusing the state's propaganda of loyalty with what is actually happening on the ground. So this is kind of the background story to how I came to study the role of cultural understandings in authoritarian legitimation. And in a way, cultural understandings have a life of their own. They also circulate independently from their instrumentalization by politicians in power. Moreover, the circulation is not confined necessarily by the borders of nation states. So contrary to the swaddling thesis, I argue that dictatorships often profit from authoritarian values that circulate transnationally. Public stories like those supposing that the domination of leaders over followers was the self-evident way to structure social life, naturalize authoritarian practices. And this is why neoliberal ideology and neoliberal techniques are often complicit in legitimating authoritarian rule because they normalize domination. And what is more, like so-called responsibilization deflects from the systemic nature of social wrongs. Responsibilization denotes the shifting of responsibility for well-being from the polity to the individual person. And responsibilization often means that those who suffer most from systemic ills are blamed for their suffering. And when poverty becomes an indicator for a person's allegedly deficient character traits, I would say we're only a stone's throw away from the stereotypical abstractions that lend racism and xenophobia plausibility. However, as I argue in the book, neoliberal incentives are often embraced due to their democratic pedigree, especially when employees or students are used to be treated as passive executors of commands or as simple receivers of prepackaged information. Neoliberal appeals may activate their belief in their capabilities. They may enliven their can-do spirit. And here again, we meet the autocratic paradox. Because since the time of Athenian democracy, such a can-do spirit is associated with an appetite for democratic participation. And neoliberal techniques employ empowerment tactics that convey that people are capable to self-determine their fate, that they can take their life into their own hands. And as such, they tap into what the philosopher Charles Taylor has identified as the genuinely modern desire for self-realization. So returning to Russia, in a very pessimistic reading, the neoliberal appeals used by Russian government agencies to date may be one of the very few public offers that provide an alternative to the military command style and the severe threats of punishment that pervade Russian society today. So the flexible aspect of flexible authoritarianism might not necessarily increase authoritarian stability. It may as well be one of the grave diggers of authoritarian rule in the long run. So now I turn to the slides and the presentation of my arguments. So does the rise of authoritarianism really constitute a backlash to neoliberal globalization? The very influential thesis. In many cases, authoritarian governments adopt neoliberal flexible policy themselves, or they continue the neoliberal reforms of their predecessors. Given that Russia is not a textbook example of neoliberalism, I'm aware of that, let me clarify how I use the term. So by neoliberalism, I mean that states shift the responsibility for the citizens' well-being from the polity to the person. I just mentioned that. And for instance, governments declare that people need to provide on an individual basis for education, unemployment, accidents, or old age. And even in the current war, the Russian government, to some degree, continues this approach. So when soldiers are wounded or impaired, the state still does little for their support or that of their families. So flexible authoritarianism is the government approach that incentivizes a neoliberal can-do spirit and thinking outside the box, but also systematically suppresses dissent and rewards obedience to authority. But why do authoritarian states need an active citizenry? So the sociologist Richard Sennett assigns today's high pressure to remain competitive to what he calls flexible capitalism. By this, he means the perceived need to quickly adapt to the changing demands of markets. Companies and employees, but also states and their citizens feel this pressure to prove their flexibility on a continuous basis. And states compete for foreign direct investments and good credit ratings because the well-being of their economies, not necessarily their citizens, depends on these factors. So states seek to align their citizens' skills and self-understandings with global capitalist demands of flexibility. Good citizens should be innovative, show initiative, and be happy to work longer hours. Motivating citizens to be innovators and entrepreneurs is even more important for emergent economies. These economies have competitive disadvantages in established markets. And international institutions like the World Bank recommend emergent economies to invest in so-called innovation-based development agendas. In a very optimistic reading, breakthrough innovations are sought to ensure sustained economic growth. Typical examples of such breakthrough innovations are the car or the smartphone. At the same time, many economists and social scientists find that innovations are more likely to be developed in democratic group atmospheres. Democratic group atmospheres are characterized by cooperation, contradicting superiors, and experimentation. And by definition, such atmospheres sit uneasily with authoritarian values, such as obedience to authority, that are crucial for authoritarian rule. What do I mean by authoritarianism? We know well that authoritarian practices exist in democracies too. Yet in states such as Russia, authoritarian practices are institutionalized. This means that democratic procedures are broken systematically and on a continuous basis. And the political scientist Marlies Glasius calls this the sabotage of accountability. And it means that the media, laws, and voting are designed in a way that ensures office holders' re-election. So most of the time, office holders are not held responsible for their wrongdoings. Moreover, intimidation and coercion are to prevent public protest, and accountability through protest is impeded through the criminalization of dissent. And Russia is a good example here, with Vladimir Putin governing for more than 20 years, despite strong indicators for electoral fraud. Since Putin came to power in 1999, the suppression of dissent has been increasing steadily. So how are cooperation, contradicting superiors, and fostering a can-do spirit, combined with authoritarian values such as unquestioned respect for established hierarchies? How did and does the Russian state seek to create the conditions in which innovations can be developed? And a good example for this combination in Russia are youth leadership summer camps. And these idiosyncratic establishments offer to young adults between 18 and 35 years summer holiday, business education, and trainings to enhance their employability. They are organized and financed by Russian state organs. About 45 of such youth leadership summer camps exist in Russia and the occupied Ukrainian territories today. And I will now show you a video clip from 2023. It's an advertisement for one of these camps. And the camp is called Youth That Takes Initiative Birusa. And it takes place annually in Central Siberia since the year 2006. For some of you, this clip's depiction of Russia might be unexpected. Breakdance, an upbeat atmosphere, pictures that remind us of leadership conferences with VIP speakers and self-development trainers. There's talk of the realization of positive ideas, and one trainer invites campers to love, create, and win. Overall, the whole clip, which was commissioned by Russian youth political organs, revolves around the theme of love, and that's amidst the war. The clip illustrates my argument that authoritarian governments such as Russia's skillfully deploy the aesthetics of cool startup capitalism and neoliberal techniques to stabilize their rule. This deployment is intended to serve economic, demographic, and political aims. So one aim is to cultivate ambition among talented youth to become innovative business people, white-collar workers, or scientists. Another aim is to convince such talented youth to stay in the country. I understand such talented young adults to be what I call potential strategic elites. And by strategic elites, I mean those people who carry out important functions in a state. It is strategic elites that promote economic growth, political stability, or scientific advance. Strategic elite support of the government is arguably more crucial for the regime's survival than that of other segments of society. A third aim is to create loyal citizens who embrace authoritarian values. These loyal citizens are expected to invest their skills in projects that enhance not only their career, but also promote the government's ideals. Yet it would be wrong to assume that authoritarian governments are all powerful and then that they can simply realize those aims. So authoritarian governments do not necessarily succeed in cultivating ambition and loyalty among talented youth. Their propaganda may just not work or not work as intended. So what upholds regimes symbolically and socially? And I argue in the book that people's loyalty is as much shaped by official speeches as by cultural understandings. And such understandings are shaped by received wisdom from popular culture. They can be entailed in stories that are told at family gatherings, at one's workplace, or at summer camps. And in all these situations, cultural understandings are crucial for communication and meaning-making. And while some understandings might be locally specific and not understood by outsiders, others might be transnationally shared. And such understandings may justify flexible authoritarianism beyond the ruling class. And I investigate these cultural understanding that potential strategic elites invoked when explaining their loyalty or their relationship to the state. So through empirical research, I sought to answer several questions. So which cultural understandings justify flexible authoritarianism in the eyes of potential strategic elites in Russia? How do often unquestioned beliefs about the economy and social life influence their expectations towards themselves, their fellow citizens, and the state? And how do public stories and cultural forms, and an example is the Soviet summer camp tradition, stabilize the regime in the eyes of these young adults? And by regime, I mean the underlying order of political and economic law. To answer these questions, I collected a variety of empirical data. I analyzed economic development and youth political documents, as well as archival data. And also I looked at video clips made by government loyal activists. I visited official institutions in Russia that are designed to stimulate citizen engagement. And I collected observational data at 2 youth leadership summer camps. One of these we just saw in the video clip. And these sites were interesting to me because potential strategic elites are directly confronted with the state's flexible authoritarian ideas at these sites. Yet more than that, such youth leadership summer camps are political spectacles that make these ideals tangible and experienceable for the campus who visit them. So the camp we just saw, Virusa, is taking place in the Krasnoyarski Krai. This is Central Siberia. The other camp I visited is called Sakha-Seliger. It has been renamed, and it's taking place in the Republic of Sakha-Yakutia in the Russian Far East or northeastern Russia. And I also interviewed campus at both of these sites, 36, but also youth political officials, and also youth political officials in Moscow. So what surprised me most when I myself participated in these camps was their emphasis on project management. And the relevant literature had portrayed them more as meeting places for young pro-Putin party militants. Those studying Russia know Seliger probably very well. Yet, as I discovered, these camps serve more as educational hubs for promising youth in provincial Russia. Campus learned how to transform their ideas into projects. They were motivated to engage in continuous self-improvement and develop a can-do spirit. They learned how to better manage their time, develop leadership skills, how to get and stay in touch with important people, and how to live healthy. They were also taught how to apply for government grants to realize their project ideas. And typical projects that campus wanted to realize could be a business startup for selling solar panels, an NGO renovating orphanages, or an educational program commemorating local veterans of the Great Patriotic War. What also struck me was that this emphasis on entrepreneurialism and realizing one's visions contrasted with the Erziehungsstil at camp. And by Erziehungsstil, I mean an organizational and pedagogical style that structured life at camp on the whole. While most trainings fostered open debate and thinking outside the box, the overall organization of camp was characterized by an abundance of rules and a deep concern for discipline. For instance, morning sports, as you can see on the picture, were compulsory. And also all of us had to wear ID badges all the time, and we had to wear them visibly. And transgressions against some of the many rules would lead to the cutting of an edge of one's badge. And 3 missing edges meant that the camper needed to leave camp. On closer inspection, lectures and trainings conveyed the 2 sets of ideas around which flexible authoritarianism revolves in Russia, that of neoliberal modernization and neo-traditionalism. And by neo-traditionalism, I mean protecting and preserving what is romanticized as Russia's cultural traditions to legitimate the pursuit of a conservative future. And this would entail the promotion of so-called traditional family values, the praise of Russia's imperial setup, and a deep veneration for the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in the Great Patriotic War. So on the left side, we see one of the billboards that was to motivate campus in the spirit of neoliberal modernization. It says, "Dreams don't work if you are not working on realizing your goals." And on the right side, we see the former Yakutian Minister of Education during a bonfire talk with members of our working group politics. And you cannot see campus faces as to protect their anonymity. So the former Minister of Education told us, amongst other things during the talk, that he had been a member of Russia's Green Party. Yet when the party became too occupied with gays, as he put it, he left it and joined the ruling United Russia Party that supports Putin. Only in 2014, when Russia annexed Ukraine's peninsula Crimea, the promotion of such neo-traditional ideals was extended to a whole speech on how the West would seek to undermine Russian traditions, for examples. Nevertheless, even then, trainings in the spirit of project management remained much more prominent at the camps. So as my interviews show, many campers really enjoyed the educational program at camp. They were especially taken with a peer-to-peer atmosphere during trainings, and being treated like capable and resourceful people was something they told me was not an experience they made in Russian educational institutions. Thus, I argue that campus fascination with camp relates to the appeal, or with those camps, relates to the appeal of the modern quest for self-fulfillment. And this quest is also entailed in the notion of the United States as a country of possibilities. And today, the Russian government uses the same slogan, Russia, country of possibilities, to rally for support among potential strategic elites. This is a screenshot from the Russian Agency for Youth Affairs from 2024. So while campers were fascinated with the prospect of shaping their life and develop their surroundings, almost all accepted the rigid Erziehungsstil at camp. And how does this fit together? And one way to explain the seeming contradiction is that most campers had a deep knowledge of what I would call the Soviet summer camp tradition. So their knowledge of the cultural form of Soviet summer camp appears to have shaped their expectations of what would happen at camp when they went there. So as we see on the Soviet poster from 1936, much of what I told you about today's youth leadership camps was also a trait of these camps for young pioneers. We can see the combination of like summer holidays with leisure and education. Here's the bonfire talk and a strict daily routine with morning sports. This is not very well visible, sorry, and curfew. The Soviet summer camp tradition, I would say, is an apt example of how handed-down cultural forms may let appear an authoritarian command style acceptable. And there's more about that in the book. So such acceptance notwithstanding, campers were outspoken about what annoyed them in Russian society and politics in our interviews. For instance, they openly and emphatically criticized favoritism and corruption. Last described life in Russia in the following terms. Putin has a circle of confidants. If you're somehow connected to this circle, everything will turn out well for you. If you're not connected to it, everything will turn out not particularly well for you. And if you relate to them negatively, everything will turn out not at all well for you. Another grievance campus mentioned repeatedly was racism, and this was especially and primarily femitized by inhabitants of the Sakha Republic. For instance, Galina, a young civil servant, told in the interview, "I always want to show them my passport. I'm a citizen of the Russian Federation." And they all say "Panayecheli," means something like we are flooded with people coming in. "Excuse me, but I live in my country and I can travel wherever I want to. And this is what annoys me, Panayecheli." Almost all campers identified passivity and indifference among their peers and fellow citizens as a major problem in Russian society. Some would even frame it as an eternal one. Maxim, a young farmer from the Sakha Republic, expressed this in the following terms. "It's like they don't care what happens beyond their house. He knows that he's in his house and receives his salary, knows that the salary suffices to feed him and his family, and that's it. And all that is connected to, let's say, the good of the population is not interesting to him because of ordinary laziness." And interestingly enough, these grievances did not transform into calls for systemic change, at least not in our conversations. And also that people went to these youth leadership summer camps was already a sign that they are not in the opposition. So how can we explain that campus grievances did not generate opposition to the flexible authoritarian regime? So for one thing, there was a strong belief among many that systemic change was simply impossible. Racism or pollution were seen as eternal problems, and power would always remain with hidden elites or circle about whom ordinary people like them could only know very, very little. For another thing, campus allegiances shifted depending on the themes raised in conversations. So whenever campus shared public stories that identified foreign enemies to Russia, their criticism seemingly disappeared. For instance, when they recounted the Soviet Union's fight against fascism during the Great Patriotic War, or when they shared their annoyance about how the West misunderstood Russia after the annexation of Crimea, the majority of interviews would strongly support the state, despite all of the shortcomings they had listed before. And certainly they wouldn't call the annexation an annexation, but they would speak of the reunification using the very same word that is used for the reunification of West and East Germany. And at least opposition to the flexible authoritarian regime was deflected by the topos of other people's laziness. Campus seemed to be convinced that passivity and indifference among their fellow citizens were the main impediment to change. Many were more annoyed with other people's passivity than with the self-serving behavior that characterizes Russia's higher echelons of power. So let me make some concluding remarks. As I argued in the very beginning, I would say we can arrive at a more nuanced understanding of loyalty in authoritarian contexts when we take cultural processes into account. With regard to today's Russia, the texture of loyalty is one in which criticism and support are tightly interwoven. Cultural understandings that legitimate authoritarianism are not confined by the borders of nation states. While some may be locally specific, others, and especially those I have designated as neoliberal, circulate transnationally. And one example is the classification of people in deserving and undeserving types. And according to the young campus I interviewed, people showing initiative deserved respect and welfare, whereas people who could suspect it to be passive or lazy did not deserve such respect and neither support. And I contend that these potential strategic elites, that their loyalty was not animated by a deep desire to regain a great power status for Russia. That was not something that was interesting to them. Instead, I argue on the basis of the interviews that their complicity with the authoritarian state is created through ambitious desires for upward mobility within Russia, by the dream to work in creative industry or as an entrepreneur and lead such a normal life. And not only in states such as Russia, neoliberal techniques and the aesthetics of business startup culture are employed for authoritarian ends. We can detect comparable tendencies in many countries where strongman rule is on the rise. And future research is needed to reveal how this works specifically and different in different contexts. But on a more practical level, and to end on that, this means that we need to change our own, but probably also other people's expectations of how contemporary authoritarianism looks and how it feels. Because, for instance, the images that my mind's eye picture when I hear the word dictatorship bear little resemblance to the contemporary design we saw in the video, or the culture of positivity practiced by instructors on campus. And the halo of contemporariness, I would say, is a crucial element in the current ennoblement of authoritarian politics, and not only in Russia. So, thank you.